You're in the right place. Hello, I'm Dan Harris.
Hi, and I'm Claudia Koestler.
You're over here, over there. Welcome to Over Here, Over There, a global conversation about how we see ourselves and others see us. I'm your host, Dan Harris, and for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be asking some stellar guests from Germany, the UK, and the US about our topic of conversation. Post-Trump, will the world be the same again? This is a recorded podcast, but you can send us your feedback via our website at overhereoverthere.org or on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I'll let you in on a secret. We had originally recorded this podcast on 5th of January. The significance of that date, I'm sure, won't be lost on our listeners. Technically, we were not in a post-Trump era then. I don't know about the rest of today's panel, but I thought if there was going to be controversy, it was going to happen when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris assumed the reins of executive power at their inauguration on the 20th of January. The next day, the 6th of January, proved that thinking wrong as the world looked on in shock and amazement at the rioting at the Capitol and the attempt to stop the certification of the 2020 presidential election. Trump's second impeachment proceeded rapidly thereafter and was passed in the House of Representatives, followed by a momentous vote in the Senate, acquitting Donald J. Trump of inciting a riot, the vote being 57-43, the largest bipartisan majority of any impeachment trial, but falling short of the 67 votes needed in a supermajority to convict. The crater that was left in America's democracy and the impact of these events couldn't be ignored. So, after the recording, the podcast on the 5th of January, we decided to re-record the episode and check our thinking again. And here we are. I'm joined by my fellow podcaster, Claudia Koestler, senior editor at the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Munich. Claudia, I said the world looked on in shock and amazement. What was the reaction in Germany?
Well, first of all, hello to you all and welcome. And in regards to your question, it can always be tricky to speak in general about any topic. But in this case, I can easily say that all the people I know here were utterly shocked and horrified by the pictures on the news, by what they saw. And many of them couldn't believe what they actually saw because it showed no resemblance to the USA we know and love and respect. And it had no resemblance to the values we all thought we'd share. And for me personally, it was something that I could not imagine possible, as it was an attack on democracy itself. So it felt for me, and a violent and bloody one as well. And when I saw those pictures of the mob storming the Capitol, my first reaction was that I might have stumbled over some bad movie rehearsal. The pictures, the scenes, they were too surreal, too bizarre to immediately recognize them as true. So my mind, firstly, wasn't capable to overcome the question, how is this possible and how could things get so far?
Yes, well, thanks for that, Claudia. And we'll get more perspective about what the German reaction is to what happened in the States and democracy going forward throughout the podcast. So I'd like to welcome Bill Barnard, former chair of Democrats Abroad UK and the Department of History at the University of Alabama, and a frequent political commentator on TV and radio internationally, and author of Dixiecrats and Democrats. Warren Moore, BBC and commercial radio presenter, who is an avid watcher of U.S. politics and attended university in Florida and Georgia, so he knows the South well. And Dr. Tom Lorman, lecturer at the University College London, specializing in Central Europe. Welcome, and thank you all for being virtually over here and over there. Bill, if I can turn to you first, I'd like to ask you an over here, over there question to do kind of double duty from both sides of the Atlantic. You've lived in the UK a long time now, but how did you view the 6th of January riot at the Capitol and the subsequent impeachment proceedings? And in turn, do you know how they were viewed back in your home state of Alabama?
You know, my initial reaction was really very much very similar to Claudia's. It was appalling. I could not believe it was happening in my America. I could not believe that kind of violent action against the very institutions of our democracy and the symbols of our democracy could occur in the United States of America. It was not the America I knew, or certainly not the America I would aspire for us to be. On the other hand, I'm reminded in retrospect that, there are dark episodes in our history where similar things have occurred. The overturning of the government in South Carolina after Civil War and at the end of Reconstruction. So there is a dark side to America's history and America's democracy that we have to contend with, and we have to continue to contend with as we move towards that more perfect union. But it was appalling, to be sure. As far as how it was perceived in the states, I think in my state, I think the reaction among most people was, again, rather horrified at the violence and that it could occur in those circumstances and at that place and at that time. Uh, on the other hand, I come from a very strong Trump era, and there are a good number of people. I hear it among some members of my family who don't believe that the election was properly decided and who are Trump supporters. So there was that element as well. But in general, the fundamental reaction the initial reaction to the violence was horror and despair.
Thank you. And Tom, you have actually dual citizenship, UK and US, with roots back in Ohio. How are things viewed on both sides of the Atlantic from that perspective? And you can also comment on, you're an expert in Central European politics. So take your pick.
Oh, thanks, Anna. Great to be here. I think the people I know in Ohio felt pretty much the same way that Bill was talking. People were surprised and horrified about what happened. That being said, and I was struck by how much in Britain there was a similar sense of surprise and horror, because I think British people to some extent feel emotionally invested in what's happening in the United States and were alarmed and shocked by what they saw. In Central Europe, there was less surprise because politics there often goes out onto the streets and occasionally turns into violence. So I think what we saw here was something where those who were emotionally invested in the United States, and particularly Americans themselves, but also British people, felt very strongly about what was happening. In Central Europe, I think they were a little less surprised.
Warren, what was your impression, being from the UK, seeing the results of the riot, and having spent time in the South?
For me personally, it reminded me, I did a lot of reading. Hi, everyone. Hi, Dan, by the way. Hope we're all keeping safe. From my little corner of the southwest UK here, for looking at it from a point of view of over here, over there, it took me kind of on a journey of the last sort of few months, if you like, of Trump's campaign. And I'd love to, if the budget ever ran to it, get some sort of time machine that we could go back. And this was predicted. This was predicted by the excellent book that I recommend everybody buys a copy of or just scans through, Mike Wolf's Fire and Fury. And it talked about what they thought the playbook would be from Trump losing the election in 2016. Of course, that didn't happen. But the idea was that they were basically for 4 years going to sit in opposition in Trump party headquarters and run interference on a Hillary Clinton presidency. And it still chills me to the bone to go back to effectively the morning after, the night before, on Wednesday, the 4th of November, to see the president, to see the most powerful and influential person in the world of politics, basically pull out the playbook that didn't work 4 years before. He stood there in the East Room of the White House and said that the election had been stolen from them. And Mike Wolf talked about this nearly 4 years before in the book. And that was basically, it was a case of all bets are off. This could go either way. It could be just crazy between then and effectively January 20th at inauguration.
I've read that book, and it is a great read. It is a great read. And it was one of the first ones out of the chute as far as the Trump and what was happening behind closed doors in the White House.
Absolutely, because it was coming from the people in there. And yet, it was talking about how 6 to 9 months to almost a year in, positions were not filled, which is just unheard of in the White House. But it will send a shiver down my spine to see that. UK time, obviously, East Coast, on the East Seaboard, it was sort of 1 a.m., 2 a.m. To have him go in there, and you expect the president to concede defeat because the optics politically look bad. Oh, no. To see him roll out the dusty playbook, dust it off, blow off the dust, and run the playbook that they were going to run from 4 years before was startling.
Well, I want to add my 2 cents in because I used to live on Capitol Hill for 3 or 4 years, and I can tell you it's a conservative town. It's a conservative town. I mean, Ted Kennedy was considered a communist, basically. He was just kind of a left-wing Democrat during his time. So it's a conservative town, and they took security very seriously. And this is even before 9/11. And in fact, I remember one incident. I was just walking across the Capitol, and I lived on Capitol Hill as well, just a few streets away from the Capitol. And there was a disturbed man. He must have been hearing voices, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs. He was in front of the Library of Congress, which is very close to the Capitol. And within minutes, within a minute, there was police. You could hear, there were sirens going off. And they took him away. And unfortunately, I'm sure he wasn't well mentally, but they were on top of it right then. So you can imagine a riot of that proportion and that significance. I just could not understand it from a very practical point of view, how that happened. I want to talk about Trump's legacy, and then we'll move on to talk about Biden and what Biden is bringing and making the change from Trump. Claudia, we're here to talk about the post-Trump, as I mentioned. But before we do that, let's talk about his legacy. How do you think Germany will look back on the Trump years? What influence did Trump have, if any, on German politics?
Quite a significant one, I might say. In regards to his legacy, it might be a bit early to tell because it will probably take some time to digest all that has happened in these last 4 years. And also, there is, of course, a risk that there are still going to be Trump years ahead of us, as I guess he's not going to be silent for too long. And he might take another attempt running for presidency or even form some sort of parallel or shadow government if he finds the platforms to do so. But if we stick a needle on that thought for a moment and just look back on what happened in the last 4 years, it feels like a dark cloud has finally lifted. What immediately comes to mind when I personally think about the Trump years is a shock and bewilderment about the damages he did, the polarization and the splitting, the war on the media, the rants, the unprecedented way he, with his high-handed attitude, provided power-hungry politicians or people with a blueprint for how democratic processes can be undermined, whether he did that on purpose or not. An attitude that you do your thing no matter what and by any means, and not striving for anything mutual. That was the kind of politic that I got from him in a way.
Sorry, I wanted to ask about Alternative for Deutschland. Did that embolden them? Did that increase their support within Germany?
I mean, it's hard to tell. It's all a bit of a speculation. We can go on that. But of course, it is kind of a blueprint for people that are trying to get their viewpoints through without acknowledging other opinions, without doing what they want to do by any means. And he provided people who are striving for that with kind of a blueprint. He ignored rules. He did not strive to anything mutual, as I said before. So he kind of went into new territories and proved that it is possible, even though a lot of people might say it's not right to do so, and you have to abide by some rules, and you have to work together, and he just did the opposite. He was kind of ruthless, like a very ruthless businessman. He was running this presidency like a ruthless businessman, I could say. And the question always is something good come out of this or not, for the people and not for themselves? And I can, as a personal opinion, I can say no. It can only nothing good can come out of it for majority of the people. And as I said before, I was often asked if the media is going to miss him in a way, because there might be not as many headlines now as there used to. But we will never know if any newspaper sold more copies due to him or not. But political commentators probably are not going to be as busy now. And there is already a miss in sharpness when you watch late night shows like Kimmel or Fallon. Trump also was an easy target. Now we all have to learn and look elsewhere again. So I personally think there is going to be more variety in topics to be expected, and hopefully some more deep digging into topics and politics.
Wow, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you later, but I can just, for myself, I could say that.
Sorry.
No, about the media and what the media will do going forward. I mean, my screen time. I don't know about the rest of you. My screen time has gone down about 60 to 90 minutes. I can vouch for that. Bill, the Senate voted to acquit Trump of inciting the riot. What does that say about U.S. democracy, both domestically and internationally?
First, just one comment about screen time going down. Mine has as well, and I'm sleeping much later in the morning. I don't wake up with my eyes wide open wondering what outrage I'm going to see on TV this occurred overnight. But to your question, I think it's sometimes forgotten that by a vote of 57 to 43, Trump was found guilty of the charges. It's just that the margin did not reach 2/3, which is what is necessary for impeachment. But a majority of the Senate, basically a rather substantial majority of the Senate, actually thought him guilty of the charges brought by the House. As far as the questions that it raises, it seems to me that the whole process raises two questions, really. One about impeachment as a process within our government, and secondly, a question about the Republican Party. We've had 4 impeachments in our history, and one attempted one as well with Nixon, none of which have resulted in the conviction and removal from office, which may tell us something about the limits of impeachment to remove a president. It can happen pretty much only when not only the majority party, but a significant portion of the minority party, they have their conscience so affronted by the action, so outraged by the actions of a president, they will vote to impeach. That hasn't happened in the 4 times when we've gone through an impeachment process. It did, in effect, happen with the removal of Nixon because he was threatened with an overwhelming vote, including a vote by Republicans, and the Republican leadership went down to the White House and basically told him his time had come and he had to leave, and he did. But so I think we have something of a sense of the limitations of the impeachment process, and we should also be reminded that it is fundamentally a political process. It's not governed by the rules of criminal procedure of a court trial, although we often make allusions to that as if it were. But it is fundamentally a political process, and its limits, quite properly really, are rather stringent. But the question this time, the other question that's raised, is that of the Republican Party and its future. How in the world can you not deem the incitement of a mob to attack the Capitol itself not an impeachable offense of which the president was guilty? And it really raises questions, and the party's wrestling with that now as we move forward in how best to deal with the Trump legacy, how to get beyond it and get to a healthier position of 2 reasonable parties, each one appealing to a significant portion of the electorate.
Well, thanks, Bill. And Tom, you made the point in our previous attempt at this podcast that history often looks back kindlier on past presidents. Do you think that's still possible with Trump?
Yes, I think it is. It's always tempting to make snap judgments about presidents. But there are dangers to that. One is that we don't always know the full story, and that will take time to come out, though I no doubt Fire and Fury and other books give us insights. The full proper story hasn't been told yet. The other thing is we always notice what happens. It takes time to notice what didn't happen. And we'll have to reflect on that over time. I mean, one thing that didn't happen is that in spite of all of the upset of the Trump period, American democracy continued to function. Even on the 6th of January, the Congress gathered together in the evening and concluded that Joe Biden had been elected.
You would concede that it came pretty darn close, though, to being undermined.
Well, I don't think even the right had any chance of undermining the result. I mean, it was an appalling thing. But fundamentally, the American democratic system was not going to be derailed by what was happening, although lives were put at risk. But the political system, I think, is strong enough to endure this. And I think that's all to the good. I think of it as a stress test rather than that it ultimately shown the durability of American democracy. Because ultimately, and this is the third point, some of what is happening with Donald Trump is reflecting deeper fissures in American society. He is no doubt possibly exacerbated those tensions and fissures, but they're there. And to some extent, we have to now recognize that they're there and work to address them. And I think Joe Biden has recognized that in his own rhetoric, that actually America needs to move forward from this. So I think for all of those reasons, I think historians are going to be looking at Trump perhaps much more as someone who reflected a particular mood rather than necessarily someone who in most cases actually created that mood.
Go ahead, Claudia.
Tom, could you describe that mood to me?
Yes. I mean, one thing is that it's actually global. There are plenty of Central Europeans who like to think that they were Trumpian before Trump. The technical term would be illiberalism, something that the Hungarian government took as its ideology, or at least briefly seized on that term. 2014, Viktor Orban, Hungarian prime minister, announced he was an illiberal prime minister. And this illiberalism, which is not just in Central Europe, but also in Brazil with Bolsonaro, arguably in India with Modi, this hostility to the old ways of doing things, or the supposed liberal consensus, that's a broader global phenomenon, and it's driven by deeper attitudes, economic problems, social attitudes, a sense of cultural change that I think Trump reflected as much as he created. There's a tendency to see things as being purely American, but in reality, Trumpism is a global phenomenon, though I don't like to use the term really Trumpism because it's hard to pin it down, but illiberalism, which I think has a better definition, is a global phenomenon, and one which we're going to see continue not only outside the United States, but inside the United States in the years to come.
You know, Dan, I think Tom's right that we're going to view it in a larger context. And that's absolutely true. And time will give us that perspective and let us do it more effectively. And I think to echo one other point that Tom made, and that is the importance of the fact that the institutions held. I mean, we can take some degree of pride that in the end, they did hold. Now, it's important. It was very important, I think, that night, the House and Senate came back to complete the count. I think that was an important symbolic action. But the one thing, while taking a little, being grateful that the institutions held and American democracy did not suffer a fundamental blow and that sort of thing, the thing that should worry us is how close it came, though. It depended in the end on the actions of certain state officials, Republicans and Democratic, who had a degree of integrity in their office and performed their office properly. And it came down to depend upon a handful of people in Georgia, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. Otherwise, we could have seen a very different scenario in the way things played out.
I was just gobsmacked, as I said, how easy it was to disturb our democracy and to undermine it on the day and to force them to come back late at night. And yes, it went ahead. The institutions held. That's great news. That's great news. But if I was a terrorist, or if I was someone with some nefarious cause, and how easy it was to pierce the democratic institutions like that.
I kind of think that is one of the beauties of democracy, that we have that openness and ability for people to be, it's the people's house, right? And therefore, we all must respect it. There will be no doubt, as we saw, I'm thinking maybe 5, 10, 15 years back, when protesters stormed into the Palace of Westminster, everybody suddenly thought, wow, well, we better put security guards up everywhere. A lot of people sat back and said, yes, we do need to look at our security as such, but we also need to let the world and our own people internally know that business goes on as usual. So one of the sorts of, democracy is a rose, therefore it's a very beautiful scented thing, but also it has its prickly thorns as well. So we have to be careful on that sort of judgment there.
Thanks, Warren. I agree with those sentiments, but to see the nation's capital and our democracy abused by a mob like that back on the 6th of January was devastating and tragic. And for someone who used to live there early in my career, I found that really distressing. Secondly, I'll just say that history works both ways. And I think that over time, given the way he left office at such a low point, his ratings during his presidency being never more than 50%, one of the lowest of any modern president, I just can't see him coming back from that, even over time. He really didn't pass any significant legislation besides a tax cut for the top 1% in our country. And with two impeachments and the indelible stain that he left on January 6th, I find it very difficult. Okay, you could argue that, there's only one way, and that is up for Donald Trump as far as the historians go. But when you add in the biggest issue since World War II being the pandemic and his mishandling of that, I just don't see any even revisionist possibility of his presidency. But that's my 2 cents. Now, that said, Claudia, here's a challenging question given what you said earlier about how you felt after Donald Trump's departure from the Oval Office. With respect to Germany, is there anything Trump did right that you point to?
Tricky question, of course. I used to say that at least he didn't start a war. And with that, I meant pushing the infamous red button. But this is no longer true when people actually died in those riots, So there is, of course, everything overshadowed by this civil riot or civil war, you can even say that. But when you ask what he did do right, and when you look at the fact that 75 million US citizens still voted for him and that he has such devoted followers, so he must have hit a nerve. And my guess is that he kind of spoke to people who felt left behind, which in my eyes is ironic, as he just, as well as a person of an elite, a higher ranking person. It might be a money elite rather than a high-ranking politician. But of course, he's not an underdog who made it and who will fight for every other underdog to achieve the same. But he seems to nourish that image with a certain clientele. At least he didn't tense it more with North Korea. He got on well with Russia, you could say, in a way, or at least it was the Cold War wasn't started again in a way, apart from some sayings and some big boy talk or whatever. But it wasn't as tense as it used to be, so that could be put as a positive.
Yes, there was some reluctance to go to war about Trump as far as engaging in military conflict. So some of the issues, one, obviously the pandemic and the economy, it's his 1.6 trillion tax cut, 83% of it went to the top 1%. That's a domestic issue. There's China with the trade war. Obviously, our allies, breakdown in relations and multilateral agreements. The Middle East peace, actually, with Israel controversially moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and then peace accords between Israel and several Arab states late in his tenure. And then, of course, you can talk about NATO, climate change. You mentioned Russia, Claudia, and Iran, pulling out of the agreement that we had with Iran under the Obama administration. Just before we get off at that subject, anyone want to jump in on that as far as what he possibly did right that benefited us internationally?
Dan, if I could have a little hype up on this here. I mean, for a lot of people, and I think we've kind of touched on it, but we really need to point this out, that for a lot of people, he was the hope candidate. Bear with me on this. It serves the Democrats well to take a long, in-depth look at where they go politically. I'd be interested to hear what Bill would say about this. Maybe this is the time for us to, when pubs reopen, sit around and have a glass of something good and chat about it. But you can look at the Democratic Party and see, other than the top echelons of Kamala and Joe Biden, then it's quite fractured in there. So for a lot of people who were not into politics previously, Trump really turned them on. And it's probably, I would be interested to find out, has it shaken the Democratic belief that the hope candidate is exclusively and has to be, as history tells us, a JFK, even a Jimmy Carter, a Bill Clinton or Obama, a Democrat? For the first time in a very long time, people were switched on by a Republican candidate.
They were, but it was a Republican candidate who appealed to fear and anxiety, not necessarily to hope, and who used that anxiety not to rally forces to move forward, but rather to denigrate the opposition. So I don't think he can really claim the legacy of hope.
No, yeah, you're right there. Yeah, I wouldn't say he was running exclusively under the banner of hope, but he spoke to people in a way that they'd never been spoken to before by a politician, and it switched a lot of people on.
Well, he did, and ironically enough, to some degree, you can argue, and the argument is made by some analysts, I've heard in the last couple of weeks, that he moved the Republican Party towards the center. And by that, they mean he moved away from a fear of deficits, he moved away from a hard line in foreign policy, and moved away from constant criticism of Social Security and other measures. And you've got people like Josh Hawley coming along promising to do the same thing that Trump promised, that is not to raise taxes or to limit benefits on Social Security. But going back to things that might be positive, I do think in the long term, we may look back. It'll all depend upon how it develops in the Middle East. We may look back upon the Abraham Accords as a positive step. Now, it did nothing to help deal with the problem of the Palestinians, and it may even complicate our efforts to come to some kind of rapprochement or some kind of agreement with Iran. But nonetheless, I think, given that how it might develop, we may look back upon that. The other big issue, it seems to me, and it's an issue that I think is going to dominate American foreign policy for most of this century, and that is the rise of China, the continuing rise of China economically, politically, geopolitically, and otherwise. And there he drew attention of the American people to the problems, to be sure, although it was not particularly a partisan approach to China, because both parties have been leery of China's role and what has been done in trade matters and the rest. Nonetheless, he drew attention to it, and I think in the public's mind, made it a more salient issue. The way he tried to handle it, working alone and taking the steps he did on tariffs and all the rest, was disastrous. And I think that the Biden administration, trying to recouple the efforts of allies to approach China on all these matters, is much more likely to work and be constructive. Certainly, Trump's approach was not. In the certain aspects, our relationship with China is going to be confrontational. In certain aspects, it's going to be competitive. In certain aspects, it has to be collaborative. That's a very complex thing, but we managed it with the Russians for a number of decades, making progress on arms control, for example, while continuing to be facing them head on in other issues. So I think that's a fundamental issue, and you can look back and say he drew more attention to it and drew the American public's attention to it, but he did nothing to help really resolve the problem, and indeed probably made it a bit worse.
You're listening to Over Here, Over There, and I'm your host, Dan Harris, with fellow podcaster Claudia Koestler, senior editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and our guest Bill Barnard, who you just heard from there, former chairman of Democrats Abroad UK and the History Department at the University of Alabama, BBC and commercial radio host Warren Moore, and Dr. Tom Lorman, lecturer at University College London's School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And we're discussing, post-Trump, will the world be the same again? If we can move on to President Biden and Kamala Harris's administration, how difficult will it be to gain the trust from our allies? Claudia?
As far as I know, Biden is allegedly famous for his ability to build bridges. So let's hope that is quite true. He recently said America is back lately at the Munich Security Conference, and that was very well received. So I think it might be possible for Biden to actually start a new era, to start something new, a new way we can all look ahead and work more together. No doubt various world leaders felt relieved to speak to Biden, as he seemed to be a coherent and knowledgeable leader. But I don't think that there can be some return to normal, as you would like to hear, because none of America's relationships with either friends or enemies is the same as it was 4 years ago. None of the major diplomatic institutions, international or domestic, is the same either. Some on the Biden team veterans probably of the Obama administration might be tempted to restart relationships and reboot old plans, just as if nothing has happened. But I don't think that can work, because America's international reputation has been transformed under Trump. Sorry to mention him again. And no longer is it the world's most admired democracy. The political system is now more often perceived as something that can be described as dysfunctional, probably.
In Germany, you have proportional representation and coalition government, which creates a moderating influence on politics, where in the UK and the US, you have winner-take-all, two-party system, pretty much. Do we have something to learn from Germany, would you say?
That sounds a bit ironic, doesn't it? But it might be something helpful to look at countries that have more than two parties, because I am quite startled whenever I read about the US parties, and the Republicans constantly refer to the Democrats as the far left, or the even worse, they're calling them names, or they are claiming they
Socialist
are
or
communists,
yes.
or something like that. Socialists, they are always the far left and the Socialist Party as a whole, and I'm quite astounded by that, because when you look at the history of the US, as far as I can recollect it, there hasn't been any democratic president who turned it into a communist country so far. And I don't know why this name calling has caught on and still is going on. So just to have, and that might be the reason that some Americans don't feel related to politics anymore, because they can't find themselves in one of those two parties. And when you have more than one, when you have the choice, you might find it a bit more diverse, and you might find yourself represented better. And if those parties, might it be 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, if they are forced to work together in a coalition, you might not be as quick with decisions or with proceeding somewhere fast, but you can rely on the fact that you're representing a majority of the people, and that you find a middle ground. And I think politics is about finding middle grounds, finding the best way forward. And that might not always be very clear, very easy, or very left or right.
So, Tom, can I ask you about Central European politics? Will regimes in Hungary and Poland feel less emboldened now that Biden is in the White House?
Well, particularly Hungary, but also Poland to some extent, had a very bad relationship with the Obama administration, and quite a good one with the Trump administration. So certainly those countries, I could also add in Slovenia and to a lesser extent Croatia, have started off a bit coldly with the Biden administration. They were hoping for a Trump victory. Nevertheless, I think there's a couple of things I want to stress about the Central Europeans. One is, in Central Europe, there is not the same obsession with the United States that one finds, for example, in Great Britain. There, Brussels and what's happening in the European Union is more important, actually, to everyday life than what's happening in Washington, D.C. After all, a major inflow of money and indeed legislation is coming from Brussels. So there's more of an attention to what's going on within Europe rather than the United States. The other thing is that Central Europeans have been told that America was a very bad country for all the way down to 1989. Communist regimes used to denounce the Yankee imperialists, pointing to Vietnam or civil rights problems. But actually, one finds criticisms of the United States, and particularly of American presidents, being leveled quite often by Europeans and others. But in general, a positive view of America is still held by most people. My experience is that they recognize the economic power of America, the opportunities that America presents. You don't have dodgy tax inspectors knocking on your doors and coming up with another way of extorting money from a businessman, for example. Rules appear to be a little bit more clearer there. And the opportunities and success stories are real. And so I think, in some sense, America remains an attractive idea to many Central Europeans, even if politically they don't see eye to eye. And I think America remains not only to Central Europeans but to the entire world. It remains a deeply attractive model for many people.
I agree with Tom. I think that positive attitudes toward the states is still there. There is increasingly an awareness that we are a flawed symbol of democracy. We are a flawed institution, but nonetheless they admire our capacity and our willingness to face some of the problems that we have and to deal with them. We never solve them all the way necessarily. That's never going to happen in a human society. But nonetheless, we recognize them and we face them and try to deal with them in one way or the other. Sometimes it takes horrendous events to lead us to screw up the courage to do that, but nonetheless, in the end, we generally come through. And there's a process for improvement there. And so I think that image is still basically strong.
I can totally agree on that.
Great. Warren, the UK's always thought that they had a special relationship with the US. Was it ever special under Trump when, say, for instance, Theresa May was holding his hand as well? And when they were coming down the stairs, that got all sorts of press over here. And will it be special under Biden?
Here's the thing. Wasn't it fascinating to note that the minute that Mr. Biden got into the Oval Office, the one thing that went straight away was the bust of Mr. Churchill? Isn't that fascinating to see just how special the special relationship is? I often wonder about this quote of the special relationship, you know. I wonder if we were doing this with a Parisian correspondent and someone in Madrid or someone in Canberra in Australia or Auckland, they'd go, well, we all have a special relationship with America. And that is pretty much because actually, if you want to be any kind of player in the world, you better have a special relationship with the United States of America. It's the big boy at the table. And I agree very much with the sentiments that Bill issued earlier on. Yeah, it's flawed, but it's still a great democracy. And you'd rather be in a world where America is effectively, for want of a better phrase, acting as some sort of world policeman, if you like. And it's a little safer, perhaps, with Biden at the helm. I tell you what has been fascinating, though, to listen to over the last 5 or 10 minutes is I think it's a pretty good time to be Anthony Blinken right now, don't you? In terms of he's going to be stamping his passport going around the world in some pretty great ways that maybe Mr. Pompeo wasn't before. I think it's a good time to be him. I think to be Secretary of State for the United States of America, where people are going to be saying, can we just get back to some kind of political normality? You know, we heard a lot about how Trump was coming from the outside. He was going to come in, and we heard that phrase of drain the swamp. I'm just wondering, from people that would know much better about this than myself, I'm thinking of Tom and well, pretty much everybody on this podcast probably, but I'm just wondering whether or not there would have been off the record communications between the major two parties in the United States of America, where someone said, when we don't necessarily look after business, look what happens when an outsider comes in. Because you could now turn around and say that the Republican Party are the big failures in this or the big losers in this, in terms of the fact that they've potentially lost their party for the next couple of general elections. So there will be that look, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether this is a German look, whether it's a Westminster bubble, whether it's the DC elite. It's like, hey, guys, we need to look after house and a little better than this and clean up better. So we don't have that scenario of the outside candidate coming in and just wrecking everything.
Tom, you want to come in on that?
A big mistake that's made from the over here perspective, which is to assume that because America is a very powerful country, the indispensable country, that also American presidents are very powerful. They have powers, but they also have serious constraints on their power. They can't even impose a mask mandate, even if they wanted to, the country. That is difficult to grasp from a European perspective, for example, where the Prime Minister of Great Britain has enormous powers. And even the Chancellor of Germany is a considerably more powerful figure in that country than the President of the United States is in the United States. And so I think one thing that's here is that Donald Trump couldn't drain the swamp. He doesn't have that power to drain the swamp, either in custom or in law. He didn't have the ability to transform things. And one quite possible interpretation of Trump and also of Biden is they actually won't be able to do a lot. I think there'll be certain some key differences, but I think it'd be surprising for people to see that actually Biden is no more in charge of America than Trump was.
You know, Tom is Tom is absolutely right about the assumption that most Europeans make, and most others around the world for that matter, make about the American presidency and his powers. They think him extraordinarily powerful. An American president would give his right arm to have the powers that the British Prime Minister has in domestic policy. Now, it is true that he has much greater leeway in dealing with foreign policy. And you may very well see after the initial push on domestic policy in the first few years of a Biden administration that there would be a turn, as there often is in the later years of the administration, towards foreign policy, because we do have a big task there. In addition to the handling the rise of China economically and politically and militarily, we also face the problem of rebuilding our alliances. It's almost incalculable how much America lost during the Trump years in dealing with our allies. Once trust is violated, once trust is the issue of mistrust arises, it's very hard to build back, whether you're talking about personal relationships or between countries. Trump's suggestion that the U.S. would not necessarily honor its commitments under NATO if a European country was attacked, it's going to be very hard really to reinstill the notion that is the case in many quarters in Europe, and turning our backs on the development of rules of the road, rules of trade for the Pacific, which is a rising economic entity in the world. That's going to be hard to re-put together as well. The other nations that were part of TPP when Trump withdrew, they've moved forward and have made further adjustments and agreements. Biden will have to somehow or another not only re-engage the European allies in dealing with China, but also somehow or another make it politically palatable and possible for the U.S. to play a role in that emerging effort to create the rules of trade in the Pacific. So I think it's one of the chief challenges, if not the major challenge in foreign policy, in China and the rebuilding of the alliances, particularly as it affects the Pacific.
In contrast to what Tom said, I was just stunned at how much power that the American president had in this day and age, and how he could politicize so many institutions and bend it to his will, and pull us out of, as you mentioned, of multilateral agreements, things that have been almost in our minds locked in stone, like NATO, and then suddenly, we're out. The landscape has changed. Are you saying that these wider powers that he has really created quite havoc internationally around the world?
Well, you're right that over the decades, the Congress in particular has yielded a good deal of the leeway and of the discretion in domestic policy to the president. This was the first president to do what Trump has done. I think Trump, in a sense, suffered from the same illusion that many Europeans have, which is that the president is all powerful. He believed that as well. Thank goodness there was a willingness in certain quarters to stand against it. But it is amazing, you're right, how much he was able to do. But I think in general, the notion that the American president is all powerful in domestic policy, that just doesn't hold at all. But in foreign policy, he does have much more leeway.
We're coming to the end of the podcast, and I just want to go back to the title of it, post-Trump, Will the World Ever Be the Same Again? Just to get everyone's take on that and to answer the question. So go back to Claudia.
I think it cannot return to something. It must find something new to build on. To be honest, I don't think that Biden is to be envied. He has a lot on his agenda. He has to get the coronavirus under control. He has to stabilize the economy, restore confidence in the democratic processes, and all that with a rifted population. I think he has already made clear that he wants to restore decency and pragmatism in a political America. And he should symbolize and propagate a return to the good, decent values, so as not to terrify possible swing voters with a sort of Damocles of socialism, as you said before, or even communism. But possibly his party is striving for a far-reaching reform or even reforms, introducing a fundamental healthcare reform, dealing with structural racism, dealing up a new Green Deal, banning fracking, and so on. And at the same time, Biden has to strike the balancing act of moderate politics to heal a country. So all of that is a lot on his plate. So I fear he might not be able to be the great reformer as some might have hoped, but he could try and fill the trenches in the country and then make way. President Biden, who spent years restoring the unity in the country through moderate reforms, cultivating a new political climate where a lot of people can agree on peacefully. He could support neutral media and good educational work, and it could bring the US back as the nation, the country we love and respect here in Germany, here in Europe. He could probably reintroduce the fairness doctrine, base it on a European model so that the country can once again have a representation of reality, what it can agree on. So this is, as I said, a lot to deal, a lot to do. And I hope it can work out to something new, refreshing, but still based on decency in a way we can all agree on, and go further into the future that is a bright and peaceful future.
And Warren, your perspective on will the world be the same again, especially from a UK point of view that needs a trade deal?
The world still turns, and I am hopeful. I'm not saying it's going to be sunshine, rainbows, and lollipops all around, but what I will say is that there was a very interesting thing that shows just how much of a potential love-in there'll be between the majority of the world's media, not just the American media. There was an event that happened, I don't know if people saw it or not, and it was the sort of first 30 days of a Biden presidency, and CNN held one of their own town hall events. They were pitching in with questions, and one of the questions was, well, Mr. President, what have you done in your first 30 days? And he gave an answer, which when I heard it, I'm such a political geek, I woke up at sort of 3 a.m. in the UK time to see this, and I expected to see a lot more hullabaloo about this. And he was asked the question, what have you done? And he expressly gave comment on the fact that he has created the vaccine program, and that wasn't there under Trump. Technically, Mr. President, not true, and he benefited from it by having 2 jabs in his arm. I expected there to be a whole load of media hullabaloo, even from your likes of Fox. They gave him a free pass. There's a lot of goodwill out there for Mr. Biden, and I think it will be very interesting to see how long that holds on for. And I think he's got quite a good hall pass, so to speak.
Great, thanks. Tom, then Bill for the final word. Tom?
Well, I'm skeptical about how much power, as I've noted, a president has, and I don't think Biden is going to achieve a lot. I certainly don't think he's going to carry out much in the way of a comprehensive reform program. American politics is too polarized. There isn't that overwhelming desire for reform shared by in both parties or by a clear majority of the population or a decisive majority. On the other hand, I think that's okay. I think it's okay to get back to a politics which is a bit more slow and a bit more boring, because actually politics by tweet is not only emotionally exhaustive, but also quite ineffective. That ultimately, I think there are larger stories at play here. And if Biden can just make a little bit of a difference, I think we'll all be actually quite appreciative.
And Bill, I don't know about you, but I get this sense of over the last 4 years of, you said like you got up in the morning and your screen time was down. You weren't looking at your phone or your laptop as often or your iPad. And I'm the same. My screen time was way down. And I guess it's really, in essence, I don't feel the threat as I did over the last 4 years. Although I'm keeping my eye on what the Republican state legislatures are doing in regards to voters' rights and voter suppression. which is a bit worrying. But that said, is that something that, as far as looking back on will the world be the same again, do we feel that, that threatening nature of change, good or bad, that was coming from Trump? How do you see it?
Well, in that regard, I think we will get back to a more normal and one would hope, as Tom said, boring politics where people aren't fixated for 24 hours on the news channels. But I agree with Claudia that I can't think of a president who's come into office facing greater crises than Biden does, whether you're talking about the virus, the economy, racial justice, and climate, all in the context of a badly divided nation. I think we will see a return, a change in tone and tenor of political discourse, a revival of some degree of civility in the process, one would hope. Certainly that is what he is striving for and what by personality he, I think, may be able to achieve. But he does, as Claudia, I think, said as well, has to not merely return to normality, but rather to rebuild so much. Not merely rebuild, but reshape our alliances abroad and reshape many of the things that we're doing moving forward domestically. I think we are perhaps underestimating the impact of this COVID bill. There's some wide-ranging programs embedded in there, and there will be even more in the second Build Back Better bill. So there may be more of a hope for some degree of significant change than Tom was expressing there. But I must say that given the way in which the American government has functioned or been dysfunctional over the last decade, you have to temper whatever hope you have with some degree of concern.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. A great discussion there. That leaves me just with the pleasure of thanking our panel, Claudia Koestler, Bill Barnard, Warren Moore, and Dr. Tom Lorman. Before we close, we'd like to remind our listeners that they can subscribe to our podcast by the button below. Over Here, Over There can be found on most major podcast platforms. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and today's podcast show notes can be found on our website, overhereoverthere.org. If you want to be a patron, we have a button for that too on our website, and we'd very much appreciate your support. Polite, insightful, humorous, and constructive comments are also welcome in any language, so please be in touch. Check out our website for our next Unmissable podcast. Until then, thank you for listening to Over Here, Over There.